Some moments in life arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary seconds that slip by unnoticed until they explode into something extraordinary. For Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer who spent her days capturing the hidden stories of nature, that moment came while perched 20 feet above the forest floor. Her camera focused on a family of eagles she had been documenting for months. What she witnessed through her telephoto lens that crisp October morning would transform her from an observer of life into a central figure in a story that would grip a nation, challenge the justice system, and prove that sometimes the most powerful evidence comes from the most unexpected sources. The single photograph she captured in that split second would become the key piece of evidence in a case that had baffled investigators for weeks, connecting a web of corruption that reached from the darkest corners of organized crime to the highest levels of local government. This is the true story of how one woman's dedication to documenting the natural world accidentally documented something far more sinister, and how her courage to come forward would put her own life in danger while bringing justice to those who thought they were untouchable. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes a single shot can change everything. Sarah Chen had always found peace in the spaces between earth and sky. At 28, she had built a reputation as one of the most patient wildlife photographers on the West Coast, spending weeks tracking a single subject to capture that perfect moment when nature revealed its secrets. Her work had graced the covers of National Geographic and Wildlife Photography magazine, but success hadn't changed her approach. She still believed that the best stories came to those willing to wait. The morning of October 15th began like countless others. Sarah arrived at Redwood Valley State Park before dawn, her camera equipment carefully packed in weatherproof bags. She had been documenting a family of bald eagles for her upcoming book about predator-prey relationships in Northern California. The adult pair, whom she had named Magnus and Athena, had successfully raised 2 eaglets over the summer, and Sarah wanted to capture their final weeks together before the young birds dispersed to find their own territories. The climbing gear felt familiar in her hands as she assembled her portable tree stand. Sarah had been rock climbing since college, and the transition to canopy photography had felt natural. 20 feet up in an old Douglas fir, she could observe the eagles without disturbing their natural behavior. The tree she had chosen stood at the edge of a clearing, offering clear sight lines to the massive nest the eagles had built in a towering redwood across the meadow. As the first light of dawn filtered through the forest canopy, Sarah settled into her camouflaged perch. Her camera, a high-end Canon with a 600mm telephoto lens, was already mounted on its tripod and focused on the eagle nest. She checked her equipment one final time, ensuring her backup batteries were charged and her memory cards had plenty of storage space. This routine had become second nature after years of field work. The forest awakened slowly around her. Squirrels chattered in nearby trees, their movements causing brief rustles in the autumn leaves. A family of deer emerged from the underbrush to drink from the small creek that meandered through the clearing. Sarah photographed them automatically, her trained eye always seeking composition and light, but her primary focus remained on the eagle nest. Magnus appeared first, his distinctive white head catching the early morning light as he landed on the edge of the nest. Sarah adjusted her camera settings, preparing for the feeding ritual she had observed dozens of times over the past months. The adult eagles typically hunted in the early morning hours, bringing fresh fish or small mammals back to feed their growing offspring. Through her viewfinder, Sarah watched as Magnus called to his family. The sound echoed across the clearing, a wild cry that never failed to send shivers down her spine. One of the eaglets appeared, its brown, juvenile plumage still weeks away from developing the distinctive white head markings of adulthood. Sarah began shooting her camera's rapid-fire mode, capturing the interaction between parent and offspring. The morning light was perfect, golden and warm, filtering through the forest canopy to create natural spotlights on her subjects. Sarah had learned to read these conditions like a language, understanding how the angle of the sun would affect her exposure settings and the mood of her photographs. She adjusted her camera's position slightly, following the eagle's movements through her telephoto lens. It was then that she noticed the unusual activity at the far edge of the clearing. Through her powerful lens, Sarah could see 2 figures moving through the trees about a quarter-mile away. At first, she assumed they were other photographers, or perhaps park rangers conducting routine patrols. The Redwood Valley area was popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts, though few ventured this deep into the forest so early in the morning. Sarah trained her camera toward the distant figures, using her telephoto lens like a telescope to get a better look. What she saw made her pause. The two men were dressed in dark clothing, moving with a purposeful stealth that seemed inconsistent with casual hiking. One was significantly larger than the other, his bulk evident even at a distance. The smaller man appeared to be gesturing animatedly, pointing toward something deeper in the forest. Her photographer's instincts kicked in automatically. Sarah began documenting what she observed, taking shots of the two figures even as she tried to understand what she was witnessing. The men's behavior struck her as odd, but she had learned through years of wildlife photography that unusual situations often yielded the most interesting stories. The larger man was carrying something that caught the morning light with a metallic gleam. Sarah adjusted her lens focus, trying to get a clearer view. Through the powerful optics, she could see that it appeared to be a briefcase or small suitcase. The way he carried it suggested significant weight. His posture strained as he followed his companion deeper into the forest. Sarah glanced back at the eagle nest, torn between her primary assignment and her curiosity about the unusual activity in the forest. Magnus had returned with a large salmon, and the feeding ritual was beginning. This was exactly the type of moment she had spent weeks waiting to capture. But something about the two men in the distance nagged at her professional instincts. As a documentary photographer, Sarah had developed a keen eye for detail and an ability to recognize when situations deviated from normal patterns. The men's movements, their clothing, the early hour, and their apparent destination deep in the forest all combined to create a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She made a decision that would change everything. Setting her camera to its highest resolution and fastest shooting mode, Sarah began alternating between photographing the eagle family and documenting the activities of the mysterious figures in the distance. Her telephoto lens could capture details at remarkable distances, and she trusted her equipment to record whatever was unfolding in the forest below. The men had stopped at what appeared to be a predetermined location. Through her lens, Sarah could see them conferring, checking their surroundings with the careful attention of people engaged in secretive activity. The larger man set down his burden and began what looked like preparation for some kind of meeting or exchange. Sarah's heart rate increased as she realized she might be witnessing something significant. Her years of training had taught her to remain calm and observant in unusual situations, to document first and analyze later. She continued shooting, her camera's memory buffer filling with high-resolution images that captured every detail her powerful lens could resolve. The sound of an approaching vehicle caused both Sarah and the men in the distance to freeze. Through the forest, she could hear the rumble of a large engine navigating the rough fire roads that provided access to remote areas of the park. The men below appeared agitated by this development, their body language shifting from purposeful to anxious. A black SUV emerged from the tree line, following one of the maintenance roads that Sarah hadn't even known existed in this part of the forest. The vehicle was expensive and clean, seemingly out of place in the rugged wilderness setting. It stopped near where the two men were waiting, and Sarah watched through her lens as the driver's door opened. The man who emerged from the SUV was tall and well-dressed, wearing what appeared to be an expensive business suit despite the forest setting. Even from her distant perch, Sarah could sense an authority in his posture that suggested he was the person the others had been waiting for. Her photographer's eye automatically noted the contrast between his formal attire and the wilderness environment. Sarah's hands moved automatically, adjusting her camera settings to account for the changing light conditions as the morning sun climbed higher. She had learned to work instinctively with her equipment, allowing her conscious mind to focus on composition and storytelling, while her muscle memory handled the technical aspects of photography. What happened next unfolded with a speed that caught everyone by surprise. The well-dressed man approached the group, and Sarah could see through her telephoto lens that some kind of heated discussion was taking place. The body language of all three men suggested tension and disagreement, their gestures becoming more animated and aggressive. The larger man with the briefcase stepped forward, appearing to offer his burden to the newcomer. But instead of accepting it, the man in the business suit stepped back, his hand moving toward something inside his jacket. Sarah's finger instinctively pressed the shutter release, her camera capturing the moment in razor-sharp detail. The sequence of events that followed seemed to happen in slow motion through Sarah's viewfinder, yet unfolded with terrifying speed in real time. The man in the business suit drew what was unmistakably a handgun, pointing it toward the two men who had been waiting for him. Sarah's training as a photographer kept her finger on the shutter release, even as her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the forest clearing, sending every bird and small animal fleeing for cover. Through her camera lens, Sarah watched in horror as one of the men collapsed to the ground. The other man, the one who had been carrying the briefcase, began backing away with his hands raised in what appeared to be a gesture of surrender or pleading. Sarah's entire body was trembling, but her photographer's instincts kept her camera steady and her finger on the shutter release. She continued documenting the scene even as her mind reeled from the reality of what she was witnessing. Years of wildlife photography had taught her to remain calm and observant during unexpected moments, and that training served her now in the most unexpected way possible. The man with the gun was speaking to his surviving companion, though Sarah was too far away to hear the words. She watched through her telephoto lens as the businessman gestured toward the briefcase, which had been dropped when its carrier backed away from the confrontation. The surviving man picked up the case and handed it over, his movements suggesting fear and compliance. Sarah realized that she had just witnessed a murder and that her camera contained photographic evidence of the crime. The weight of that realization settled over her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. She had spent her career documenting the natural world, capturing moments of beauty and wildness that most people would never see. Now she had accidentally documented something far more sinister, something that would thrust her into a world she had never wanted to enter. The man with the gun was walking back toward his vehicle, carrying the briefcase that had apparently been the object of the meeting. His companion helped him load what appeared to be the body of the murdered man into the SUV. Sarah continued photographing, her camera's high-speed mode capturing every detail of the crime scene cleanup. As the black SUV disappeared back into the forest, Sarah remained motionless in her tree perch, her camera still focused on the now empty clearing where a man had lost his life just moments before. The Eagle family continued their morning routine in the distance, completely unaware that their photographer had just become the sole witness to a murder that would change everything. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah remained frozen in her tree perch, her camera still trained on the empty clearing where moments before she had witnessed an execution. Her mind struggled to process what had happened, oscillating between the surreal feeling that she had imagined it all and the stark reality captured in the hundreds of high-resolution images stored on her camera's memory card. 20 minutes passed before Sarah felt safe enough to move. Her muscles had cramped from maintaining the same position, but fear had kept her absolutely still, terrified that any movement might draw attention to her hiding place. She carefully lowered her camera and checked the images on the LCD screen, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the photographic record of the crime. The camera had captured everything with devastating clarity. The telephoto lens had compressed the distance, making the violent scene appear closer and more immediate than it had felt in real time. Sarah could see the faces of all three men with remarkable detail, their expressions frozen in moments of anger, fear, and cold calculation. The sequence of images told a complete story, from the initial confrontation through the shooting and subsequent cleanup. Sarah's first instinct was to flee. Every survival instinct screamed at her to pack up her equipment and leave the forest as quickly as possible, to pretend she had never been there and never seen anything. But as she looked at the images on her camera, she realized that she held evidence that could bring a killer to justice. The moral weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She began the careful process of dismantling her equipment and descending from the tree. Every sound in the forest made her freeze, listening for any indication that the killers might be returning. The normal sounds of wildlife seemed amplified and threatening. A breaking branch sounded like approaching footsteps, and the rustle of leaves in the wind became whispered conversations between unseen watchers. By the time Sarah reached the ground, her photographer's bag packed with equipment and evidence, she had made her decision. She would go to the police and report what she had witnessed. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach and made her hands shake as she secured her climbing gear. The hike back to her car felt endless. Every few hundred yards, Sarah stopped to listen, scanning the forest for any sign that she was being followed. The men who had committed the murder clearly knew these woods well enough to use them for their deadly business. The thought that they might still be in the area, possibly watching her even now, made every step feel like a potential mistake. Sarah's mind raced as she walked, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. The expensive SUV, the businessman in the suit, the briefcase that seemed to be at the center of the conflict. It all suggested something far more complex than a random act of violence. This had been planned, organized, professional in its execution. She was dealing with people who killed without hesitation and clearly had the resources to operate with impunity. When she finally reached her car, Sarah sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine. The normal world seemed strange and disconnected after what she had experienced. Other cars passed on the park road, their occupants probably heading out for routine hikes or nature photography, completely unaware that a murder had been committed just miles away. The drive to the nearest police station took 45 minutes, during which Sarah rehearsed what she would tell the officers. How do you explain that you accidentally witnessed a murder while photographing eagles? How do you convince skeptical cops that the images on your camera represent real evidence of a serious crime? The Mendocino County Sheriff's Office was housed in a modest building that served several small communities scattered throughout the rural region. Sarah had never been inside a police station before, and the institutional atmosphere of fluorescent lights and official notices felt intimidating and foreign. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up as Sarah approached the front counter. "I need to report a crime," Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the turmoil in her mind. "I witnessed a murder this morning in Redwood Valley State Park." The sergeant's expression shifted immediately from routine politeness to sharp attention. Within minutes, Sarah found herself in an interview room, speaking with Detective Ray Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department who specialized in serious crimes. Martinez was a stocky man in his 40s, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Sarah's appearance and demeanor. Sarah told her story from the beginning, explaining her presence in the forest, her purpose for being there, and the sequence of events she had witnessed. Detective Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly focusing his complete attention on her account. When she finished, he asked to see the photographs. The images on Sarah's camera told their story with stark, undeniable clarity. Detective Martinez's expression grew increasingly grave as he scrolled through the sequence of shots. The high-resolution images captured not only the crime itself, but also clear, detailed views of the perpetrator's faces, the license plate of the black SUV, and the specific location where the murder had taken place. "These photographs are remarkable evidence," Martinez told Sarah after reviewing the entire sequence. "The level of detail is extraordinary. We can identify the individuals involved, and we have documentation of the entire crime from beginning to end. This is the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about." But Martinez's expression also carried a note of concern that made Sarah's stomach clench with renewed anxiety. "However," he continued, "the quality of this evidence also means that if the perpetrators become aware of its existence, you could be in significant danger. These images could put very dangerous people away for life, which gives them powerful motivation to prevent that from happening." The detective's words confirmed Sarah's worst fears. By doing the right thing and coming forward with evidence, she had potentially placed herself in the crosshairs of professional killers. The weight of that realization settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Martinez called in additional investigators and began the process of formally documenting Sarah's statement and securing the photographic evidence. A forensic photographer made multiple copies of her images, and a technician analyzed the metadata to confirm the time and date stamps. Every aspect of the evidence was carefully preserved according to legal protocols that would allow it to be used in court. While the technical work proceeded, Detective Martinez began making phone calls to other law enforcement agencies. The professional nature of the crime, combined with the expensive vehicle and formal attire of one perpetrator, suggested connections to organized criminal activity that might extend beyond his jurisdiction. Sarah listened to fragments of his conversations, hearing references to federal agencies and ongoing investigations that made her realize she had stumbled into something much larger than a single isolated murder. The FBI arrived within 3 hours of Sarah's initial report. Special Agent Linda Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, was a specialist in organized crime who had been tracking various criminal networks operating throughout Northern California. When she reviewed Sarah's photographs, her reaction was immediate and intense. "This is Vincent Torino. Agent Chen said, pointing to the image of the man in the business suit. He's a high-level operator in the Benedetti crime family, suspected of involvement in at least a dozen murders over the past 5 years. We've been trying to build a case against him for 3 years, but witnesses have a tendency to disappear or suddenly develop memory problems. The identification of the killer as a professional criminal confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the danger she now faced. Agent Chen explained that Torino was known for his ability to eliminate problems efficiently and permanently. If he discovered that Sarah had witnessed and photographed his crime, he would almost certainly attempt to silence her. A witness protection specialist was brought in to discuss Sarah's options. The federal government could provide complete protection, including a new identity and relocation to a distant city where she could rebuild her life in safety. But that protection would require Sarah to abandon everything she had built in California: her career, her friends, her life as a wildlife photographer. Alternatively, she could accept limited protection while remaining in the area to testify when the case came to trial. This option would allow her to maintain her normal life, but would require constant vigilance and significant security measures. The choice was difficult and life-altering regardless of which path she selected. Sarah asked for time to consider her options, but Agent Chen explained that time was a luxury she might not have. Once the arrests began, word would leak about the evidence and its source. Torino had extensive connections throughout law enforcement and the legal system, informants who would likely alert him to the investigation's progress. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a residential neighborhood, 20 miles from the sheriff's office. Federal agents had secured the location within hours of Agent Chen's arrival, and Sarah found herself essentially under house arrest for her own protection. The house was comfortable but felt like a prison, with armed agents stationed outside and strict protocols governing her contact with the outside world. Sarah spent her first evening in protective custody reviewing the photographs she had taken, seeing them now not as documentation of wildlife behavior, but as evidence in a murder case that could reshape her entire life. Each image represented a moment when her finger had pressed the shutter release, capturing details that would either bring justice or potentially cost her everything she valued. The federal agents explained the next steps in the investigation. Search warrants were being prepared for locations associated with Torino and his criminal network. Financial records were being subpoenaed to trace the money that might have been in the briefcase Sarah had photographed. A multi-agency task force was being assembled to coordinate what was expected to be a complex investigation, with connections reaching far beyond the single murder she had witnessed. But all of these efforts depended on Sarah's willingness to testify and her ability to survive long enough to do so. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed of the safe house, listening to the quiet conversations of the agents protecting her, Sarah realized that her life as a wildlife photographer documenting the natural world had ended the moment she pressed the shutter release that morning. Whatever came next would be entirely different, shaped by the deadly secret she now carried, and the dangerous people who would do anything to prevent that secret from being revealed. The arrest of Vincent Torino happened at dawn on the third day after Sarah's witness statement. Federal agents surrounded his luxury home in the hills above Napa Valley, executing a coordinated operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Sarah watched the news coverage from her safe house, seeing the man she had photographed committing murder being led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled fury. But the arrest, which should have brought Sarah relief, instead marked the beginning of her most dangerous period. Agent Chen had warned her that once Torino was in custody, his criminal associates would move quickly to identify and eliminate any threats to their organization. The photographs Sarah had taken didn't just implicate Torino. They provided a window into a larger criminal network that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. Within hours of the arrest, Sarah learned that she wasn't the only person in danger. The second man from the forest, the one who had survived the confrontation, had been found dead in his apartment with a single gunshot wound to the head. His death was made to look like suicide, but investigators immediately recognized it as a professional execution designed to eliminate a potential witness. They're cleaning house, Agent Chen explained during one of her daily briefings with Sarah. Torino may be in custody, but his organization is still operational. They're systematically eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of their activities. The fact that they found and killed the surviving witness so quickly shows they have sophisticated intelligence capabilities. Sarah's world had shrunk to the confines of the safe house and the constant presence of federal protection. She couldn't contact her friends or family without potentially exposing her location. Her photography equipment sat unused in the corner of her temporary bedroom, a reminder of the life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. The investigation had expanded far beyond the single murder Sarah had witnessed. Financial analysts were tracing complex money laundering operations that stretched across multiple states. The briefcase that had been the focus of the Forest meeting contained evidence of corruption reaching into local government, law enforcement, and legitimate businesses throughout Northern California. Detective Martinez visited the safe house to update Sarah on the local aspects of the investigation. The murder she had witnessed was apparently the culmination of a dispute over territory and tribute payments between the Benedetti crime family and smaller criminal groups operating in the region. Torino had been sent to collect a substantial payment from a local operation, but the meeting had gone wrong when the local criminals tried to negotiate better terms. "The man you saw killed was Tony Ricci," Martinez explained. "He ran drug operations in 3 counties and was trying to reduce his payments to the Benedetti family. Torino was there to remind him that those payments weren't negotiable. When Ricci refused to cooperate, Torino made an example of him." The surviving man, identified as Marcus Webb, had apparently been Ricci's lieutenant and the designated messenger who was supposed to carry word of Ricci's death back to other local operators. Instead, the criminal organization had decided that Webb represented a liability and had eliminated him before he could potentially cooperate with law enforcement. Sarah struggled with the psychological weight of her situation. She had spent her career observing and documenting the natural world, finding peace in the cycles of predator and prey that governed wildlife behavior. Now she found herself trapped in a similar cycle, but one where the predators were human and the stakes were life and death. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a psychologist who specialized in witness protection cases, began meeting with Sarah to help her process the trauma and adjust to her new reality. Dr. Torres explained that what Sarah was experiencing was common among witnesses who accidentally became involved in serious criminal cases. "You're grieving the loss of your normal life," Dr. Torres told her during one of their sessions. "Even though you're physically safe, you've lost control over fundamental aspects of your existence. That sense of helplessness and uncertainty is one of the most difficult aspects of witness protection." The sessions helped Sarah understand her emotional responses, but they couldn't address the practical reality of her situation. Every day in protective custody was another day away from her career, her relationships, and the life she had built. The longer the investigation continued, the more difficult it would become to return to any semblance of normalcy. Agent Chen brought news that both encouraged and terrified Sarah. The photographs she had taken were yielding an enormous amount of investigative information. Facial recognition software had identified several previously unknown associates of the Benedetti crime family. License plate readers had tracked the movements of the black SUV to multiple crime scenes over the past 2 years. The metadata from Sarah's camera had provided precise timing that corroborated other evidence in related cases. "Your photographs are helping us build cases against an entire criminal network," Agent Chen explained. "But that also means more people have motivation to silence you. We've intercepted communications suggesting that there's a substantial bounty on your head. These people view you as an existential threat to their organization." The bounty revelation made Sarah's protection even more intensive. The safe house was upgraded with additional security measures, and her protection detail was expanded to include specialists in counter-surveillance and threat assessment. Every person who came near the house was thoroughly vetted, and Sarah's movements outside the house were completely prohibited. Meanwhile, the legal case against Torino was moving forward rapidly. Federal prosecutors were preparing multiple charges including murder, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. Sarah's photographs would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing irrefutable evidence of Torino's guilt in the Ricci murder. But building a successful prosecution required more than just evidence. It required a living witness, willing and able to testify. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Sullivan, visited Sarah regularly to prepare her for the legal proceedings ahead. Sullivan was an experienced prosecutor who had handled numerous organized crime cases, and he understood the challenges Sarah faced. "Your testimony will be the most important element of this case," Sullivan told her during one preparation session. The photographs are powerful evidence, but they need your first-hand account to give them context and meaning. Without your testimony, the defense will argue that the images could have been manipulated or taken out of context. The preparation process was exhausting and emotionally draining. Sarah had to review her photographs repeatedly, explaining every detail to prosecutors, who would need to present the evidence to a jury. She had to practice telling her story in a way that was clear, credible, and legally precise. Every aspect of her account would be challenged by defense attorneys representing some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. As the weeks passed, Sarah learned more about the scope of the criminal network she had accidentally exposed. The Benedetti crime family operated drug trafficking, money laundering, illegal gambling, and protection rackets throughout Northern California. They had corrupted officials in law enforcement, local government, and the judicial system. The murder she had witnessed was just one small part of a vast criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. The investigation had also revealed the existence of other witnesses who might be able to provide additional testimony against the crime family, but most of these potential witnesses were either dead or too terrified to come forward. Sarah's accidental documentation of the murder had provided law enforcement with a rare opportunity to penetrate the wall of silence and fear that typically protected organized crime operations. Dr. Torres helped Sarah understand that her situation, while terrifying, also represented an opportunity to make a significant difference in her community. The criminal organization had caused immeasurable harm through drug trafficking, violence, and corruption. By coming forward with her evidence, Sarah was helping to protect countless potential victims of future crimes. But the weight of that responsibility was enormous. Sarah had never sought to become a crusader against organized crime. She had simply been trying to photograph eagles when she accidentally witnessed a murder. Now she found herself at the center of one of the largest organized crime investigations in Northern California history. The pressure on Sarah increased when Agent Chen revealed that the crime family was actively searching for her. Surveillance teams had been spotted near her former apartment, and individuals matching the descriptions of known Benedetti associates had been asking questions about her at locations where she had previously worked. "They know who you are," Agent Chen warned her. "Our intelligence suggests they've identified you as the source of the photographic evidence. They're systematically checking every location where you might seek shelter. Your protection is holding, but they're not giving up." Sarah realized that even if she survived to testify, her life would never return to normal. The crime family had long memories and longer reaches. Witnesses who testified against organized crime often had to live with the threat of retaliation for years or even decades after trials concluded. The psychological toll was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Sarah had nightmares about the murder she had witnessed, seeing Torino's face and the moment when he pulled the trigger. She had anxiety attacks when she heard unexpected sounds outside the safe house. The constant presence of armed guards reminded her every moment that her life was in danger. But perhaps most difficult was the isolation from everything and everyone she had cared about. Sarah couldn't contact her parents, who lived in Seattle and had no idea what had happened to their daughter. She couldn't reach out to friends who were probably wondering why she had disappeared. Her photography business was effectively dead, her equipment gathering dust while her clients moved on to other photographers. As the trial date approached, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could testify helping to bring dangerous criminals to justice, but potentially signing her own death warrant. Or she could refuse to testify, effectively ending the case against Torino and allowing a murderer to escape justice while potentially saving her own life. The choice would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone who might become a victim of the criminal organization she had accidentally exposed. In the trees that October morning, Sarah had been an observer documenting the natural world. Now she had to decide whether to remain hidden or step into the light and face the consequences of what she had witnessed. The assassination attempt came 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. Sarah was being transported from one safe house to another as part of routine security protocols, when the attack unfolded with military precision. The convoy of 3 vehicles was traveling along a remote stretch of highway when the lead car suddenly exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the early morning darkness. Sarah was in the second vehicle, sandwiched between 2 federal agents when the shooting started. The surviving cars came under immediate assault from multiple positions, high-powered rifles sending bullets crashing through reinforced glass and steel plating. The driver of Sarah's vehicle fought to maintain control as the car swerved wildly, tires shredded by gunfire and the engine beginning to smoke from bullet damage. Agent Chen, who was riding in the passenger seat, barked orders into her radio while returning fire through the shattered side window.
"Phoenix is under attack. We need immediate backup and medical support.
Officers down." The radio crackled with responses from law enforcement agencies throughout the region as every available unit began racing toward their location. The ambush had been perfectly planned and executed. The attackers had chosen a stretch of highway where the convoy would be isolated and vulnerable, far from immediate backup, but close enough to escape routes that would allow them to disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire, the rapid crack of high-velocity rounds designed to penetrate armored vehicles. Sarah's driver, Agent Mike Rodriguez, managed to get their damaged vehicle off the highway and behind a concrete barrier that provided some protection from the continuing gunfire. But Sarah could see that they were trapped, surrounded by attackers who had positioned themselves to cut off all escape routes. The third vehicle in the convoy had been disabled by gunfire, its occupants taking cover behind the engine block while engaging the attackers in a fierce firefight. "Stay down and stay calm," Agent Chen told Sarah as bullets continued to impact their position.
"Backup is en route. We just need to hold out for a few more minutes."
But Sarah could see the concern in the agent's eyes, the recognition that they were outnumbered and outgunned by attackers who had clearly studied their protection protocols and planned accordingly. The attack lasted 17 minutes, though to Sarah, it felt like hours. She pressed herself against the floor of the vehicle, listening to the sounds of combat while trying to process the reality that professional killers were trying to murder her to prevent her from testifying. The abstract threat that had been discussed in briefings and security meetings had become terrifyingly real. When the first police helicopters appeared overhead, the attackers began their withdrawal as efficiently as they had executed their assault. Sarah heard the sound of engines starting and vehicles departing at high speed, leaving behind spent shell casings, damaged vehicles, and 3 wounded federal agents. The precision of their retreat suggested the same level of planning that had characterized their attack. Agent Rodriguez had been hit in the shoulder but remained conscious and alert. The agents from the third vehicle had sustained injuries but were alive and able to provide medical assistance to more seriously wounded colleagues. Sarah was physically unharmed but psychologically devastated by the realization of how close she had come to death. The aftermath of the assassination attempt transformed Sarah's protection from intensive to absolute. She was moved to a highly classified federal facility that specialized in protecting witnesses facing extreme threats. The location was kept secret even from most of the investigators working her case, and access was restricted to a handful of federal agents with the highest security clearances. Agent Chen, despite her injuries from the ambush, insisted on continuing as Sarah's primary contact with the outside world. Her left arm was in a sling from shrapnel wounds, but her determination to see the case through to completion had only been strengthened by the attack. She visited Sarah daily to provide updates on the investigation and to prepare her for the trial that everyone knew would now be even more challenging. "The attack confirms everything we suspected about this criminal organization," Agent Chen told Sarah during one of their sessions. "They have significant resources, sophisticated intelligence capabilities, and absolutely no hesitation about targeting law enforcement. But it also shows how desperately they want to prevent your testimony. They wouldn't have risked such a high-profile attack unless they viewed you as an existential threat." The investigation into the assassination attempt quickly revealed disturbing information about the scope of corruption within the criminal network. The attackers had possessed detailed knowledge of the convoy's route and timing, information that was supposed to be classified and available only to a handful of federal agents. Someone with access to the highest levels of the investigation was providing intelligence to the crime family. FBI counterintelligence specialists began conducting intensive background checks on everyone involved in Sarah's protection and the prosecution of the case. Polygraph examinations, financial audits, and surveillance of law enforcement personnel became routine as investigators attempted to identify the source of the security leak. The process created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made an already difficult situation even more stressful. Sarah's psychological state deteriorated significantly after the assassination attempt. Dr. Torres increased the frequency of their sessions and brought in additional specialists to help Sarah process the trauma of nearly being killed. Sleep became almost impossible, interrupted by nightmares that replayed the sound of gunfire and the sight of exploding vehicles. What you're experiencing is entirely normal for someone who has survived a targeted assassination attempt, Dr. Torres assured her. The human mind isn't designed to process that level of direct personal threat. Your reactions are signs that your psychological defense mechanisms are working to protect you from overwhelming trauma. But understanding the normalcy of her psychological responses didn't make them any easier to bear. Sarah found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, scanning every room for potential threats, and questioning whether any location could truly be safe from people with the resources and determination to find and kill her. The legal proceedings continued despite the assassination attempt, though with significantly enhanced security measures. Prosecutor Sullivan visited Sarah at her new secure location to continue trial preparation, but the sessions now took place in rooms that had been swept for electronic surveillance and with armed guards stationed outside the door. The attack actually strengthens our case in some ways, Sullivan explained to Sarah. It demonstrates the lengths to which this criminal organization will go to prevent the truth from coming out. When we present evidence of the assassination attempt to the jury, it will underscore the significance of your testimony and the courage it takes for you to come forward. But the prosecutor also acknowledged that the attempt on Sarah's life had made the trial infinitely more complex. Security for the courthouse would need to be extensive, potentially requiring the presence of federal marshals, local police, and private security contractors. The jury would need to be protected and sequestered to prevent any attempts to intimidate or influence their decision-making. Sarah learned that she wasn't the only person who had been targeted by the criminal organization. 2 other potential witnesses had been killed in apparent accidents, and several law enforcement officers involved in the investigation had received death threats against their families. The Benedetti crime family was conducting a comprehensive campaign to derail the prosecution through intimidation and violence. The scope of the criminal network's reach became even more apparent when investigators discovered that the organization had been monitoring Sarah's family in Seattle. Surveillance teams had been watching her parents' home and workplace, apparently gathering information that could be used to pressure Sarah into refusing to testify. Federal agents had to extend protection to Sarah's family, effectively placing them under house arrest to ensure their safety. They're trying to give you an impossible choice, Agent Chen explained. Testify and risk not only your own life but the lives of everyone you care about, or refuse to testify and let a murderer go free. It's a classic intimidation tactic used by organized crime to silence witnesses. Sarah's parents were brought to a secure federal facility where they could meet with their daughter for the first time since she had entered witness protection. The reunion was emotional and difficult, as Sarah had to explain to her parents why their lives had been turned upside down by her accidental witnessing of a murder. Her father, a retired engineer, struggled to understand how taking photographs of eagles had led to death threats and federal protection. "I keep thinking this must be some kind of mistake," her mother said during their conversation. "This is the kind of thing that happens in movies, not to families like ours. How do we go back to normal life after something like this?" It was a question that Sarah herself had been grappling with for months. Even if the trial concluded successfully and the defendants were convicted, the criminal organization would continue to exist. Other members would assume leadership roles and carry on the business of drug trafficking, money laundering, and violence. Sarah would likely need some form of protection for the rest of her life. The Witness Protection Program offered Sarah the option of complete relocation and identity change. She could be given a new name, a new background, and a new life in a distant city where no one would know about her connection to the case. The federal government would provide financial support while she established herself in a new career under her assumed identity. But accepting witness protection would mean abandoning everything that defined her as a person. Her career as a wildlife photographer would end, as her photographic style and areas of expertise would eventually make her identifiable to anyone searching for her. Her relationships with friends and family would become impossible to maintain, as contact with her former life would create security risks that could expose her location. Dr. Torres helped Sarah understand that the decision about witness protection wasn't just practical. It was fundamentally about identity and the question of who she wanted to be. You've been forced to confront some of the most basic questions about human existence. The psychologist told her. What are you willing to sacrifice for safety? What principles are worth risking your life to defend? These are questions that most people never have to answer directly. As the trial date approached, Sarah realized that regardless of what happened in the courtroom, her life as she had known it was over. The assassination attempt had demonstrated that the criminal organization would never stop trying to eliminate her. Even successful prosecution of the current defendants wouldn't end the threat, as the crime family would continue to view her as an enemy who needed to be silenced. Sarah's decision about whether to testify had evolved from a choice between safety and justice into a choice between different types of sacrifice. She could refuse to testify and potentially save her own life while allowing murderers to escape justice, or she could testify and help convict dangerous criminals while accepting that she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. The weight of that choice was overwhelming, but Sarah found herself returning to the images on her camera from that morning in the forest. She had captured not just evidence of a murder, but a moment of truth that revealed the nature of the people who had turned her world upside down. In the end, the decision about whether to testify would determine not just the fate of the defendants, but the kind of person Sarah would choose to be in the face of the ultimate test of courage and character. The federal courthouse in San Francisco had been transformed into a fortress for the trial of Vincent Torino and 7 associates charged in connection with the murder Sarah had witnessed. Concrete barriers blocked vehicle access to the building. Federal marshals with automatic weapons patrolled the perimeter, and every person entering the courthouse passed through multiple layers of security screening that rivaled airport protocols. Sarah arrived for her testimony in an armored vehicle surrounded by a convoy of federal agents. She had been housed in a secure federal facility for 2 days prior to her court appearance, isolated even from her legal protection team, to minimize the risk of security leaks. The woman who stepped out of the vehicle bore little resemblance to the confident wildlife photographer who had climbed trees to capture images of eagles. Months of witness protection had changed her physically and psychologically in ways that might never be completely reversible. The courtroom itself was packed with law enforcement officials, federal agents, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and a carefully screened jury that had been selected through an exhaustive process designed to identify individuals who could render an impartial verdict despite the intense media coverage and security concerns surrounding the case. Sarah had never been in a federal courtroom before, and the formal atmosphere felt intimidating and surreal. Prosecutor Sullivan had prepared Sarah extensively for this moment, but no amount of preparation could fully eliminate the fear that gripped her as she walked toward the witness stand. She could feel the eyes of the defendants upon her, particularly Vincent Torino, whose cold stare seemed to carry the weight of his reputation for eliminating problems permanently. The man she had photographed committing murder was now sitting just 30 feet away, dressed in an expensive suit, and surrounded by a team of high-powered defense attorneys. The prosecution's opening statement had laid out the case methodically, describing the criminal organization's structure, their methods of operation, and the events that led to the murder in the forest. But everyone in the courtroom understood that Sarah's testimony would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the crucial element that would transform her photographs from simple images into evidence of premeditated murder. Sarah raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, knowing that her life depended on the credibility of her testimony. Prosecutor Sullivan began with basic questions designed to establish her background and her presence in the forest on the morning of the murder. Sarah's voice was steady as she described her career as a wildlife photographer and her project documenting the eagle family that had brought her to Redwood Valley State Park. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah began describing what she had witnessed through her telephoto lens. She had practiced this testimony dozens of times with prosecutors and FBI agents, but speaking the words in open court while the defendants listened felt entirely different. Every detail of her account would be challenged by the defense attorneys, and any inconsistency or uncertainty could undermine the entire case. I was photographing the eagle nest when I noticed unusual activity at the far edge of the clearing, Sarah testified. 2 men in dark clothing were moving through the forest in a way that seemed secretive and purposeful. As a photographer, I'm trained to notice unusual behavior and document it, so I began taking pictures of what I was observing. Sullivan guided Sarah through her testimony with careful precision, establishing the timeline of events and the technical details of her photography equipment. The prosecutor wanted the jury to understand that Sarah's telephoto lens was capable of capturing fine details at remarkable distances, and that her professional training made her a reliable observer of human behavior and interaction. When Sullivan introduced Sarah's photographs as evidence, the courtroom atmosphere became electric with tension. The images were displayed on large screens that made every detail visible to the jury, the defendants, and the spectators. Sarah watched as the jurors examined the photographic sequence that documented the murder from beginning to end, their faces reflecting shock and disgust at the violence they were witnessing. The photographs told their story with devastating clarity. The sequence began with images of the two men waiting in the forest, then showed the arrival of the black SUV and Vincent Torino's emergence from the vehicle. The confrontation, the drawing of the weapon, the shooting, and the cleanup were all captured in high-resolution detail that left no room for misinterpretation. "Can you identify the person you saw shoot and kill Tony Ritchie?" Sullivan asked, knowing that this moment would be crucial for the prosecution's case. Sarah looked directly at Torino, forcing herself to meet his cold stare despite the fear that made her hands tremble. "That man," she said, pointing at the defendant. "Vincent Torino. He drew a handgun and shot Tony Ritchie in the chest." I photographed the entire sequence of events. The defense's cross-examination was brutal and relentless. Torino's lead attorney, a skilled criminal defense lawyer named Patricia Hawkins, attacked every aspect of Sarah's testimony with surgical precision. She questioned Sarah's memory of events, suggested that the photographs might have been manipulated, and argued that Sarah's distance from the crime scene made accurate observation impossible. "Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you were over a quarter-mile away from the alleged crime scene?" Hawkins asked, her tone suggesting that such distance made reliable testimony impossible. "Yes, but I was using a 600 mm telephoto lens with professional-grade optics," Sarah responded, drawing on her technical training to explain her equipment's capabilities. At that magnification, the subjects appeared much closer than they actually were. The images showed details that would be impossible to capture if my equipment weren't capable of accurate long-distance photography. Hawkins continued her attack, suggesting that Sarah's fear and stress had distorted her memory of events, that her desire for publicity had motivated her to embellish her account, and that the timing of her photographs could have been manipulated to create a false narrative. Each question was designed to introduce doubt about Sarah's credibility and the reliability of her evidence. But Sarah's technical expertise and the objective nature of her photographic evidence proved difficult to challenge effectively. The metadata embedded in her camera's digital files confirmed the time and date of each photograph. Ballistics experts had matched the timing of Sarah's images to audio recordings from nearby seismic monitoring equipment that had detected the gunshot. The chain of evidence from Sarah's camera to the courtroom had been meticulously documented and preserved. The most dramatic moment of the cross-examination came when Hawkins attempted to suggest that Sarah had fabricated her entire account for financial gain. "Isn't it true, Miss Chen, that you've been negotiating with publishers and movie producers about the rights to your story?" the defense attorney asked. "That's absolutely false," Sarah replied with genuine anger. "I never wanted any part of this. I was just trying to photograph eagles. Being forced to testify against murderers has destroyed my life, not benefited it." The emotional authenticity of Sarah's response seemed to resonate with the jury, who had been listening to technical testimony about lens magnification and digital image processing. Here was a woman whose life had been turned upside down by accidentally witnessing a crime, not someone seeking fame or financial reward. The prosecution's case extended far beyond Sarah's testimony and photographs. Financial experts testified about money laundering operations. Law enforcement officials described the criminal organization's structure and methods, and forensic specialists presented evidence linking the defendants to multiple crimes. But Sarah's eyewitness account and photographic documentation remained the centerpiece that tied all the other evidence together. The defense attempted to present alternative theories about the events in the forest, suggesting that the shooting might have been self-defense or that other unknown individuals might have been responsible. But the clarity and comprehensiveness of Sarah's photographs made these arguments difficult to sustain. The images showed Torino drawing his weapon first, shooting an apparently unarmed man, and then calmly disposing of the body. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Sullivan returned to Sarah's photographs, displaying them once more for the jury, while emphasizing the courage it had taken for her to come forward with evidence that put her own life at risk. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, these images speak for themselves. They show Vincent Torino committing premeditated murder and they show the callous way he disposed of his victim. Sarah Chen risked everything to bring you this evidence. The question now is whether justice will be served. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, arguing that the evidence, while compelling, might not tell the complete story of what happened in the forest. But the photographic documentation was so comprehensive and clear that the defense's arguments seemed increasingly desperate as they attempted to explain away what the jury had seen with their own eyes. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. Sarah waited in a secure federal facility during the deliberations, accompanied by Agent Chen and Dr. Torres, who helped her prepare psychologically for whatever outcome might emerge from the courtroom. The waiting was almost unbearable, knowing that her future life would be determined by the decision of 12 strangers who had never met her before the trial. When the verdict came, it was swift and decisive. Vincent Torino was found guilty of first-degree murder, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. 6 of his 7 associates were also convicted on various charges related to their involvement in the criminal organization. The only acquittal came for a defendant whose connection to the specific murder had been less clearly established by the evidence. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and continued apprehension as she heard the verdicts being read. Justice had been served, but her personal safety remained uncertain. The Benedetti crime family still existed, and Torino's conviction would likely motivate remaining members to intensify their efforts to eliminate her as a threat to their continued operations. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks after the verdict. Torino received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and his extensive criminal history. As he was led away in shackles, he turned to look directly at Sarah one final time, his expression promising that their conflict was not over despite his imprisonment. In the months that followed the trial, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. The Witness Protection Program could provide her with a new identity and a fresh start in a distant city, but it would require her to abandon everything that had defined her existence. Alternatively, she could attempt to rebuild her life under her own name while accepting the ongoing security risks that came with her notoriety. Sarah chose a middle path that surprised everyone, including herself. She relocated to Alaska, where the vast wilderness and sparse population provided natural security while allowing her to continue her work as a wildlife photographer under her own name. Federal authorities provided discreet monitoring of her new location, and Sarah learned advanced security protocols that allowed her to maintain reasonable safety while pursuing her profession. The story of the photographer who accidentally documented a murder had attracted international attention, bringing Sarah opportunities to work with conservation organizations around the world. But she found herself drawn increasingly to projects that combined her artistic skills with social justice advocacy, using photography to document environmental crimes, human rights abuses, and other situations where visual evidence could drive social change. 5 years after the trial, Sarah received news that Vincent Torino had been killed in federal prison by inmates connected to a rival criminal organization. His death eliminated the primary threat to her safety, but by then Sarah had already built a new life that incorporated both her passion for wildlife photography and her hard-earned understanding of how images could serve justice. Standing in the Alaskan wilderness with her camera, photographing a family of brown bears fishing for salmon, Sarah reflected on how that single shot in the California forest had changed everything. She had lost the innocent joy of pure nature photography, but she had gained something else. An understanding of how her skills could serve purposes larger than artistic expression. The eagles she had been photographing that October morning had long since dispersed to find their own territories, following the natural cycles that had governed their species for millennia. Sarah had followed her own version of that dispersal, finding new territory where she could continue her work, while living with the knowledge that sometimes the most important photographs are the ones you never intended to take. The camera that had captured Vincent Torino's crime now traveled with Sarah to document stories of environmental conservation, indigenous rights, and wildlife protection in some of the world's most remote locations. Each photograph carried the weight of her experience, the understanding that images could change lives, bring justice, and sometimes put the photographer in danger. Sarah never returned to Redwood Valley State Park, but she often thought about the Eagle family that had unknowingly played a role in bringing a murderer to justice. In the natural world, Predators and prey existed in delicate balance, each playing their role in maintaining ecological harmony. Sarah had learned that human society operated under similar principles, and that sometimes ordinary people were called upon to play extraordinary roles in maintaining that balance. The shot that changed everything had been fired not by Sarah's camera, but by Vincent Torino's gun. But it was Sarah's finger on the shutter release that had ultimately brought justice to a man who thought he was above the law. In the end, the observer in the trees had become something more, a witness to truth, a guardian of justice, and a photographer whose most important work would always be the pictures she never planned to take.